Hello and welcome to the Dublin Bay UNESCO Biosphere. I'm joined today by my colleague, Marianne Harris. Marianne Harris has responsibility for nature-based solutions in the Climate Action Regional Office. And I'm also joined by Emily Brockington. Emily is a final year student at Texas A&M University. Thank you for joining me today, ladies.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Hi, thank you.
Thank you. So Emily, I've mentioned there that you're a final year student at Texas A&M University, and as part of your course, you were required to do an internship. And I believe that was a little bit challenging under the current pandemic.
Yes, it was. I was still able to go overseas and be sort of in the environment of where I was doing research, but I wasn't able to meet anyone in the company or work with anyone directly because of COVID. So I worked remotely that way.
Sure, fantastic. Yeah, I imagine, during the current conditions, it would even be difficult to try and find a location where you could actually undertake your internship. So that kind of brings us on to Marianne Harris. We've received the application there from Emily looking for an internship. And thankfully, yourself, you were able to come up with a fantastic program that could accommodate Emily's skills, and in particular her skills at GIS mapping. So perhaps you could tell me a little bit about the program that you put together and why you maybe put it together.
Sure, no problem. So Emily was seeking to work in coastal ecosystems, and as you know, Dublin Bay Biosphere has plenty of those. And we had been, in particular, studying the patterns of how the geese, the protected Brent geese, have been flying inland increasingly over the years and leaving the coastline for feeding. And this has been intriguing to us in terms of animal behavior, but also in terms of how to manage the lands that they're feeding on. And we also had some areas that were proposed for development where these geese were feeding regularly. And this has been slightly contentious as well at times in terms of what are the purposes of the management of these green spaces and how should they be used and how can we coexist with the increasing demands of the protected birds. So these are all birds that are protected under the European Commission legislation under the Birds Directive, and some of the habitats they use are also protected under the Habitats Directive. So we have a legal obligation to ensure their protection and that we don't cause any deterioration to the sites in Dublin Bay where they are designated for. And we also have an obligation to protect grounds that they feed and rest in. So this is also something we need to consider, and having that knowledge is essential in terms of where are the sites, what are the patterns. Now we also have designated through the biosphere buffer zones around the protected areas, which include many of the green spaces that we were thinking that the geese are using. But we wanted to also try to determine, are we correct in our thinking? Have we got it right? Are the areas that are zoned in the biosphere covering enough of the areas that they feed in? Do they overlap, or are there anomalies there where the geese prefer a site, but it's not anything to do in the biosphere zone? Because in terms of managing the biosphere, this is a very real issue, and it helps in terms of our adaptive management. Now, the species we're talking about, just in terms of climate change, they're migrating from the Arctic, from the Canadian Arctic, and they're passing along the Atlantic through Iceland and down through the UK as well as the Republic of Ireland. So these are migratory birds, and how we manage the sites for their winter feeding affects their reproductive success when they go back to the Arctic to breed. And the Arctic ecosystem is increasingly under threat from climate change impacts, as we know, due to the change in global warming, the change in temperatures, and the loss of certain habitats in the Arctic. We also have in Ireland and in Europe, loss of these wetlands due to development, pollution, and again, climate change is changing these through sea level rise. So when we're looking at this problem in Dublin, it has a global implication. Mm-hmm. And you know, what we're trying to do can help to discover ways to address these threats.
Yeah, so they're under pressure, obviously.
Yeah, various types, yeah.
From the Arctic, but also locally with their feeding sites. I mean, obviously, when they first come to Ireland, they're feeding on eelgrass in the biosphere, but they're not solely using the biosphere, and that's what this research tried to find out and basically identify what, you know, where they're going and what they're doing.
Yeah, so the eelgrass is a habitat, you know, in terms of seagrasses, they are hugely valuable for storing carbon, mm-hmm. but they unfortunately are in decline. They're one of the habitats that are threatened. And they would prefer not to have to fly inland because they're using a lot of energy to do that. And they're also getting more exposed to us because they're landing on our football pitches and things. Mm-hmm. And they're finding we're there, the dogs are there. You know, there's a lot of activity that they'd rather not encounter. So it's not their preference to do it. It's because they have to.
Yeah. So the program that you designed basically gave Emily the opportunity to use various research papers, is that correct, to identify where the Brent geese were heading when they'd done their initial feeding, and identify those key zones that are possibly within the biosphere, possibly not.
Yeah, so what we had was we had several data sets that were collected for different purposes. Some were for like planning applications to try to determine in terms of a proposed development what the usage was in a given area. Some of them were records that were collected through citizen science, through different research groups and projects. And some of them were records by other students, postgraduate students who did research on their thesis, for example. And then we also had records from the various parks departments themselves of the sites that they manage.
Okay, fantastic. So Emily, over to you now. Obviously you were set this task, and I believe you have a presentation that you'd like to share to highlight some of your findings, is that correct?
Yes, I do. I will share that now.
Great, looking forward to it.
Oops, sorry.
That's okay.
Okay, can you see that?
Absolutely, that's perfect. Thank you.
So over this past summer, I was able to work with 3 counties for Dublin Bay Biosphere, including Dublin, Dún Laoghaire, and Fingal. A lot of my work included data input in Excel, creating figures from this data, and creating maps using GIS. So I first collaborated with Marianne for Dublin City. I was given this park shapefile for DCC Parks, and I used the park shapefile to compare it with green spaces from Scott Colley 2017. I digitized the Scott Colley green spaces that were not found in the DCC park shapefile, and then I was then able to create this map showing those parks and Scott Colley green spaces that weren't found on that shapefile. And then from there, I was able to compare these green spaces against each biosphere zone, including the transition, buffer, and core area. So as you can see, there are a few sites that are not located in the biosphere zone, and I will elaborate that on the next slide. So this data was taken by Scott Colley during the 2016-2017 season. There are a total of 81 sites located in DCC, and of these sites, about 29.6% are in the buffer zone, 38.3% are in the transition zone, 1.2% are in the core area, and 30.9% are not in the biosphere at all. These percentages were calculated by counting the areas in DCC and dividing that by the number in each biosphere zonation. So the high percentages received from the transition zone and none are significant and concerning. Biosphere zonation in DCC, I think, should be reevaluated, as several inland feeding sites are shown to be outside of the biosphere. So by using this information, a report can be made about the possibility of rezoning these current areas to better protect Brent goose feeding sites. So this map was also created using Scott Colley data, highlighting important grazing areas for Brent geese. There are some cluster areas mainly found in the northeast region. So as you can see, there are quite a few major areas, especially along the coast. These two maps are comparing sites that are both in Scott Colley and the other source, Benson 2009. These are some of the sites in Benson 2009 that were not documented by Scott Colley, but some of these areas are already digitized by the part shapefile or digitized by myself, and these are some of those sites. I compared this source with sites in Scott Colley and found that they were already included in the data. Alfie Burn Road green space is adjacent to the River Tolka estuary, north of the River Liffey, and is protected as part of the South Dublin Bay and River Tolka Estuary SPA. Both Alfie Burn Road, green space, and Belcamp Park provide important grazing for Brent geese each season. So next I worked with Anne Murray and Tess Hanby, the PhD student for Dunleary. I was given this parks and open spaces shapefile, to which I was then able to compare with some biosphere zones again. The only site in Benson 2009 found in Dunleary was Kilboggett Park, noting a peak count of 10 in 2008 to 2009 season. Those numbers have since increased. So both of these tables show the only sites noted in Scott Colley that were located in Dunleary, including Blackrock College, Blackrock Park, Williamstown Park, St. Andrews Playing Pitches, Kilboggett Park, and the GAA pitches located in Sandyford. So table 1 shows some of those known inland feeding sites surveyed by Scott Colley, which the biosphere zones are in, and the level of significance is based on the beak count, with major being over 401, high being between 51 and 400, and moderate being 1 to 50. And table 2 shows the peak count ever recorded for each site and a breakdown for each peak season surveyed. So with the information I had, I was able to make a map showing these areas of significance against the biosphere zones. And using information I collected from the NPWS website, I was able to download special protection area and special area of conservation layers to see how they looked against Dunleary and the surrounding area. These areas cover a small portion of the county itself, which also raises the question of whether or not to rezone these protected areas, and I think it should be strongly considered. This data was taken from Tess Hanby, her research in the 2018-19 and 2019-2020 seasons. The first graph shows GPS data used to calculate the average proportion of daytime spent on land or water according to the municipality of catch site. And it makes sense that most of this time is spent on land because of breeding and feeding. And the second graph shows GPS data used to calculate the average proportion of daytime spent on those designated protected sites. So as you can see, there's a huge percentage of geese using land areas that aren't under special protection. So both of these figures are also created using the same GPS data. So calculations show average proportion of daytime spent on the specific site types. So the main habitat for daytime feeding of these urban roosting geese were sports and leisure facilities. This includes community sports grounds and school pitches, as they generally have trimmed grass, which is what these geese prefer. And geese tagged in the 2018-2019 season for this habitat type was about 59.2%, seeing an increase in the 2019-2020 season was 65.9%. So GPS data collected by Tess Hamby, with most sites also noted in Scott Colley, were not recorded prior to the 2019-2020 season, but they are still important terrestrial foraging sites. So this information on the geese with GPS tags included catch location, if they have a breeding partner, the number of juveniles, and the number of data points collected across the season. So I was able to take those GPS data points and compare it against the different biosphere zones and special areas. Lastly, I worked with Fingal. I unfortunately did not have a lot of data provided to me at the time when analyzing Fingal, but I was still able to use Scott Colley and Benson and other sources to show some important areas. So these are sites noted by Scott Colley in 2017. And these are points showing the level of significance noted by Scott Colley against each biosphere zone again. There are only a few places noted by Benson 2009 that are found in Fingal, but I just noted that on the graph, on the map. And this map shows all of the green spaces noted by Scott Colley and Benson and the relation to the biosphere zones and the special protected areas and the special areas of conservation. So some future work. There is a DCC habitat map that can be used to analyze Brent goose habitats in the region. I also didn't have enough time to ground truth these sites, but I think that would be very helpful in knowing the kind of areas that these geese are landing on. Since there wasn't a lot of information covering Dunleary from Scott Colley or Benson, Tess Hamby's work is vital, and it should be looked at more closely as it contains a lot of information for the county and possibly for more future research. And Hans is also a PhD student who has done a lot of work with Fingal. And though I didn't have enough time to look over his work more, I think his work should be analyzed further as it could be useful in GIS and beyond as well. And that's all I have today.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Emily. That's very interesting. So Marianne, I'm going to bring you back in there. Obviously, Emily's done a fantastic body of work there. So how do you see that, how do you envisage that benefiting the biosphere? And Emily touched on some of the things that we can do maybe going forward. Do you have any areas that you'd like to add, that you'd like to see done so that we can actually get further benefit from this kind of work?
Well, at the moment, there are reviews going on for each of the local authorities of their development plans. These are their plans that they're making for the next 7 years, really. So how the lands are planned for the future in these development plans will need to be considered, and that would include the zoning categories. So the planning departments will create maps, and they will zone in different categories all the different lands in their jurisdiction. So it'll be very important to look at, are some of these going to be developed, these sites? Are they being proposed or zoned for development? And quite a number of them will be. There will be quite high density development going in, which is the ongoing challenge, because We have public transportation along the bay. We have a train line running along the bay, the DART, which is the main commuter railway line. And under national policy, you can put very high density with very little green space onto sites that are near train lines. So you get less strict requirements than you normally would to provide green space. And also if you're near the coast, that is also the national policy that the density can be increased with the presumption that you can use the coast for recreation instead of providing public green space in your development. Now, that presents a challenge for the protected areas as well, but it also may remove some of these sites from through development permanently. So that needs to be looked at. The other thing Emily had there on the slide about the habitat map. So for Dublin City, all the habitats have been mapped in 2020. And it would be important to look at what types of habitats the geese seem to prefer and how to manage for those. And that sort of approach that was taken was based on satellite data of vegetation types. So it's based on that as well as other baseline data. So that could be expanded, that type of mapping across the biosphere to get all of the habitats mapped. And that would tell you a lot about connectivity of habitat, because it's one thing to pick sites based on spotting the geese, you know, and that depends on sampling effort. So to go back to my earlier point, a lot of this was voluntary. So it depends on whether people are in an area recording or not when the geese are there. And we know from what happened last year with the data from Tess Hanby's study in Exeter, she couldn't come over from England to do any counts because of the COVID restrictions. So we just don't have observations now for that year. We have a gap in the data, and that's problematic for the trends. So to get beyond simply observing the geese, if you could look at the habitat types, then you could see what potential sites there are. Even if the geese aren't known to use them currently, you might decide you want to manage on a habitat basis, or you might want to look at the area that they have. Some of the sites are a third of a hectare even, that small. They're very pressured. So it might be the case that some green spaces could be managed differently, and you could effectively enlarge the potential feeding areas that way. So again, if you focus from a habitat management approach, it mightn't be that you have to actually acquire a lot of additional green space. It might be just how you manage the ones you have differently. The issue about the biosphere zonation, as you can see, there was quite a gap. Theoretically, Emily should have found that the sites were 100% in the buffer zone or the core zone. Now, I wouldn't have expected the core zone because the way the site was designated originally by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they never designated the inland feeding sites as part of the Natura site. So when the tide comes in, where do the geese go was never really answered. You know, they were always going to have to go potentially inland a bit. And that was never accommodated for. It was only in the bay itself, in the seagrass habitat that was designated. So it's a bit of a riddle there, you know. So you would have said, okay, they're not really going to be in the core zone. They're going to be in the buffer zone. And okay, you have some in the transition zone. So that just suggests that maybe you need to reconfigure your transition zone. But to have them in none of the three zones, then you have a challenge.
Yeah, the biosphere's due a 10-year review in 2025, is it? 2024? So at that point, you know, this research that Emily's done will, I'm sure, help influence, you know, the mapping of the biosphere and may actually change how the core buffer and transition zones are what areas are covered by those areas?
Well, it suggests that those sites, that 31% that are outside the net of the biosphere, will now need to be closely watched for the next 3 years, because a lot could change in 3 years too. So if you're going to now wait till 2024 or 25 to look at it, Emily's research will be effectively out of date unless it's actually monitored, and it will need to be tracked. So what Emily's done is she didn't collect the data. What she did was she pulled it together and analyzed it in a different way. And people collected it for a few different purposes, as I said at the beginning. And she's repurposed the data to create an approach that enables that sort of holistic monitoring. And instead of a developer who's concerned just about their land, now you're looking at it in totality, and how different sites fit into the jigsaw is unknown. And this is something that is being debated quite a bit, is how important the site is. So what Emily has used is Scott Colley, which they base their thresholds on the standards in Ireland for national and international thresholds in terms of the numbers at one time on a site. And that kind of can be used for Brent geese, but it won't be usable necessarily for all the other protected birds in Dublin Bay, because we know that certain species don't congregate that way. So you're never going to find 1% of them all on one park ever at a given time. Yeah. So we'll have to think of other ways to look at thresholds of significance. So that you can get into, well, is it a major site or is it a minor? Or do you just have a rule of thumb, like, look, if it's used every year at a certain level of frequency, then it's important enough. I don't know, because I do think it's difficult. And I think, I don't know, you can see from Emily's work that there's fluctuation in the results. And again, it's down to sampling effort. And in a given year, things can change.
Yeah. So having more research taking place on an annual basis, looking at all the key species and identifying all the locations is a recommendation if we're going to understand what's happening in the biosphere more effectively. And then obviously that comes down to cost. And these are the challenges, we have, but, we're making a good case that, these are important species. We need to understand what's happening. And, we need to do this work to make that a reality. So, at least we have that as backing, if we need to look at securing additional support and additional funding. So, all this is beneficial on that basis.
But also you can see that from Emily's work, I think, Emily, maybe you might want to talk about it from an educational point of view. So you're providing help there, but there's also an educational value for you. I mean, you can include, students need supervision, and it's not everything is for free, but you can see that when you have students like Emily taking stock of this and doing this type of analysis. I don't know what you think, Emily, but the educational value is also there, not just for the geese themselves.
Yeah.
Right, yes, I was definitely learning along the way. I had taken GIS classes in the past, and I was pretty confident in what I was doing, but there were still things that I was learning from you, from other partners that I've worked with. I learned a lot during this whole experience that benefited me in the best way, I think. So
we need more Emily Brockingtons undertaking this kind of research and putting together this kind of data to help support the work that we're doing. And there's potentially a cost-effective way of doing it, and that means linking effectively and certainly more effectively with the third-level institutes that we have locally. Yeah, good advice.
Yeah, structured internships. You can see, Emily, how long did you spend on this study again? Just remind me.
I think about 2 months, a little over 2 months.
At full time.
Yes.
Yeah. But you can see how a very targeted internship like Emily's, with a very defined task, is very effective at bringing a focus to the problem and getting the information. That some of that has been sitting there, what it would be fair to say, for quite a number of years, Emily.
Yes. Yes.
So it's finally getting, it's finally getting utilized.
Yeah.
So it's not always about having a big budget and going around and collecting lots of data. It's actually taking, devising things that you can actually use data that you have as well in a more clever way.
Absolutely. Well, ladies, look, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your efforts. It's greatly appreciated. And I'm sure this video recording will be of great benefit to those that take the opportunity to view it on our YouTube channel. And hopefully it'll be taken up by our friends at UNESCO and shared, because the UNESCO biospheres are all about learning together, sharing information, and I'm sure this approach will be of great benefit, not only to the Dublin Bay biosphere, but to other biospheres around the world. So Marianne, thank you, and Emily, thank you for all your efforts. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks.
Thank you.